In our Words for All Ages, we just heard Sarah told the story about why we talk about bad things. And if you are like me, this hit you in the feels. Now remember, last week we talked about feeling our feelings. So I'm going to ask you to dive in a little deeper into them with me right now. You may want a tissue handy. I've got mine and extra in the pocket. There are some around. There are some tissues around. It's okay, right? We can cry. We can cry here, right? Is this a safe, can we all agree that this is a safe place to cry? Okay, thank you. Think back with me to the first time you lost someone you loved. Perhaps it was a pet or a grandparent or a friend. Perhaps it wasn't a death, but that someone dear to you moved away. A friend. Or maybe you moved away. Close your eyes if you need to. And as you think back, can you recall the emotions you felt as you were experiencing that loss? Remember those feelings. Think about where in your body you felt those feelings. And maybe you don't have to think back very far at all. Maybe there is a loss that is alive in you right now. And you know just where those feelings are. Let's breathe through feeling this loss together. Good. Thank you. And now come back into this present moment with me. What I invited you to touch just now is your grief. Grief is something that we all have. It is what unites the human family. We often think of grief as the sorrow that we experience during a loss, but grief is really a complex stew of emotions. And our thinking on it has come a long way since the stages of grief were first defined by Swiss psychiatrist Dr. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross back in 1969 in her book on death and dying. How many of you are familiar with that book? It really penetrated our cultural awareness. Now, On Death and Dying was based on Kübler-Ross's observations of dying patients. Her model was originally linear. First, patients who learned of their impending death would experience denial, and then anger, bargaining, depression, and finally, and hopefully, they would experience acceptance. This model changed how we think about grief. We weren't able to really talk about grief very well at all before this. And it became a part of our cultural understanding, not just of the dying process, but of grief in general. And it allowed us to talk about grief with a common language in ways we had just not been able to before. But it turns out this model was not science-based. And it does not describe most people's experiences. And actually, it was never even meant to apply to the bereaved, but only to those who are experiencing dying themselves. That's how hungry we were for understanding grief, that we took something that was close and we made it connect with us. Now, fast forward to contemporary times, and we know a lot more about grief than we used to. And perhaps most importantly, we know that it is absolutely not a linear process. In her 2021 book, Atlas of the Heart, scientist and researcher Brené Brown identifies 3 primary elements we experience as we grieve: loss, longing, and feeling lost. Loss, longing, and feeling lost. And we go between those and even feel them all at the same time. Brown says that grief is a place we go to when we are hurting. And she quotes Robert Niemeyer, a psychology professor at the University of Memphis, who happens to be one of the world's most prolific grief researchers, who says a central process in grieving is the attempt to reaffirm or reconstruct a world of meaning that has been challenged by a loss. Niemeyer says that grieving is a process of meaning making. We human beings are meaning makers, aren't we? Now notice there's no acceptance here. Indeed, there's not really even an end. Instead, grief finds a place in our lives. It becomes incorporated into us. Grief is a place that we go to when we are hurting, and once we have visited that place, it is right here, or wherever you store it in your body, in our core memories, able to be accessed like we did just a few moments ago. And it can, and it will be, triggered by future losses. In 2015, the psychotherapist Francis Weller wrote a book called The Wild Edge of Sorrow: Rituals of Renewal and the Sacred Work of Grief. Now, this work is more spiritual than scholarly, the way Brown's or Niemeyer's is, and because of that, it gives us a different metaphor through which we can understand grief, a different lens. If grief were a crystal prism, we could twist it and look through a different lens. Weller explores the connections between grief and gratitude, between sorrow and intimacy, and the new vitality that can come when we embrace, rather than fear, the pain of loss. If grief is the place we go when we are hurting, as Brené Brown described, Weller gives us 5 ways to access that experience, 5 ways that we can enter into the communal hall of grief. And, he says, entering grief through one of these gates helps us to understand the many ways that loss touches our hearts and souls in this life. Because, as both Brown and Weller agree, grief needs to be experienced and to be honored in order for us to truly integrate it into our lives. The only way out is through, after all. The first gate to grief that Weller identifies is one that most of us understand and have experienced: that everything we love, we will lose. Everyone, everything that we love, we will lose. Yes, he says it's true that we will keep those whom we have loved in our hearts, but it is grief that allows our hearts to stay open to this love. When we acknowledge that everything, everyone we love, we will lose, we allow ourselves to keep that love accessible. If we don't, he writes, our losses become great weights that drag us down, pulling us below the threshold of life and into the world of death. It is the bittersweet embrace of love and loss that sharpens our appreciation for those we love now. As Unitarian Universalists, we don't have a shared belief about what happens when we die. Some of us believe that that's it, the end, close the curtains, we're done. Some of us believe in reincarnation. Some of us believe in a heaven where our questions will be answered or where our essences will be reunited with our loved ones. But we know there are no assurances. In this world, here and now, we will lose everyone and everything that we love through our own deaths, through the loss that we experience, through departure, through change. When we acknowledge this, Weller says, we honor our grief and allow ourselves to expand, to live more wholeheartedly in the moment. So that's the first and most commonly talked about gate of grief, through acknowledging that everyone, everything we love, we will lose. But the other gates aren't as big or bold or as easily recognized. The second gate through which we might enter into grief is through the places in us that have not known love. These are profoundly tender places precisely because they have lived outside of kindness, compassion, warmth, or welcome. Weller writes, these are the places within us that have been wrapped in shame and banished to the farthest shores of our lives. These are the parts of ourselves that often we hate, that we do not show to others. But by hiding these parts of ourselves away, Weller says, we deny these parts of ourselves the healing salve of community. The places in us that have not known love may be due to shame, something that none of us are born with, but we all seem to learn. Or the parts of us that have not known love may be born out of trauma or regret. Instead of allowing ourselves to walk through this gate, we often try to protect ourselves through creating an impenetrable armor around ourselves, walls that cannot be breached. However, if we can truly weep for ourselves and for those places within us of shame, we have invited the first soothing waters of healing to wash through our souls, Weller says. Grieving, by its very nature, confirms worth. I am worth crying over. My losses matter. You, beloveds, are worth crying over. And your losses matter. We can enter into grief, access it by recognizing and even embracing those parts of us that have not known love and perhaps have craved it. The third gate that Weller identifies is the sorrows of the world. Oh, we feel that right now, don't we? Whether or not we consciously recognize it, the daily diminishment of species and habitats and cultures is noted in our psyches, Weller writes. Much of the grief we carry isn't personal, but shared. It is communal. It takes everything that we have to deny the sorrows of the world. And we heard in our Words for All Ages why it's so important not to. And we heard in our prayer from the Reverend Sophia Betancourt why it's so important to let ourselves feel the pain. It is that lie of impenetrable armor that we bring up around ourselves to protect ourselves from the sorrows of the world. We try to deny these sorrows because they feel so overwhelming, the loss or denial of our human rights, gun violence, the refusal of those in power to deal with our changing climate, war, the death of innocents. Everywhere we turn, we experience this sorrow. We numb ourselves. We ignore the news. We try to escape. But when we do this too much, now a little bit is absolutely okay, and sometimes we absolutely have to take a break. But when we do this too much, we are cutting ourselves off from the power of our grief, the power that grief can give us to make change, to learn from our mistakes. We are cutting ourselves off also from the relief that we might feel if we allow ourselves to feel it and acknowledge that grief, especially when we do so in community. So how do we possibly stay open to the endless assaults we experience? Weller says that it takes a heart of courage and conviction, one willing to not turn away, but instead look into the center of suffering and remain present. When we open ourselves and take in the sorrows of the world, letting them penetrate our insulated hut of the heart, we are both overwhelmed by the grief of the world and in some strange alchemical way, Weller says, we are reunited with the aching, shimmering body of our planet and those of us who live on it. Our suffering is mutually entangled, the one with the other, as is our healing. To name this grief, to speak it into the world, to be witnessed by others, allows us to harness it. When we enter grief through the gate of the sorrows of the world, rather than constricting our hearts and making them small and hard, it can expand our capacity for empathy, for change, for connection with others. This is why it's so important that this be a safe place that we can bring our grief, that this worship together is a place where we can safely feel, cry, let our guard down. The fourth gate to grief that Weller identifies is what we expected but did not receive. This can be a more difficult one to identify, Weller says, because it calls forward the things that we may not even have realized that we have lost. We human beings are born into this world ready for, expecting, wired for connection with each other, connection with other human beings, connection with the earth itself. The core of this grief is our longing to belong. And even when we don't know it is missing, we know when we find it fulfilled. Those of us who cried when we first came to church, a church that told us that we were loved and that we were lovable, a church that was filled with people who might be your people. Those tears you wept time and again, maybe even every Sunday for months at a time, that was me. That was you entering grief through this gate. When we gathered again after the pandemic in person and worship, we walked through this gate. How many of you had an emotional experience when you walked back into the sanctuary for the first time after the pandemic? It was very powerful. We are shaped for closeness and for intimacy with our surroundings, Weller writes. Our profound feelings of lacking something are not a reflection of our personal failure, but a reflection of a society that has failed to offer us what we were designed to need and expect. Weller also identifies another facet of this gate that we human beings want, need, and are designed for purpose. Deep in our bones, he says, lies an intuition that we arrive here carrying a bundle of gifts to offer to the community. Over time, these gifts are meant to be seen, developed, and called into the village of need. When we use these gifts, when they are recognized by those around us, this affirms our feelings of worthiness. We like to help. We want to be of support. We want to work to create something together. To not find our purpose, to not use these gifts in the service of something larger than ourselves, as we expect to be able to do through our genetic coding as human beings, is to not receive that which we expected. This is another reason why religious community is so important, because it's a place where we can use our gifts. Finally, Weller identifies a fifth gate to grief, ancestral grief. Weller says this is the grief we carry in our bodies from sorrows experienced by our ancestors. This grief often lingers in silence, unnamed. It may be ancestors who chose to leave their families and communities behind to go to a new world or a new place. It may be ancestors who were forced to leave their families and communities behind. Ancestors forced off their ancestral lands. Ancestors, too, who perpetrated these acts of violence against others. These ancestors often coped by adopting a secondary layer of suffering: alcoholism, isolation, rage, and a restrictive silence that cut themselves off from the living support of others. The rich and nuanced patterns of culture that had evolved over time, Weller writes, were replaced with strategies designed simply to help them survive. Gone were any patterns that held myth or song or ritual and the poetic imagination as the heartbeat of a people. And so sometimes new patterns, new culture, new myth, new stories, new songs, new rituals are created. But when they are not, we particularly feel this ancestral grief. Generations later, it can become concentrated over time, and this grief can manifest as shame passed down from generation to generation, or as a family systems pattern repeating itself, even unknowingly. This grief is often hidden and hard to get out, but Weller shares that if we can't figure out the source of the grief that we're experiencing, if we are just experiencing free-floating grief and we can't nail it down somewhere else, if we dig deep into ourselves, it may be because this is grief that has been passed down from generations. These, then, are the 5 gates into grief that Weller identifies. Number 1, everything we love, we will lose. Number 2, the places within us that have not known love. Number 3, the sorrows of the world. Number 4, what we expected but did not receive. And number 5, ancestral grief. We can access grief through any of these gates. We can access grief through them one at a time, but it is also common for a loss or a sorrow to experience more than one, to trigger more than one. For instance, in grieving the death of a parent with whom we had a complicated relationship, we may enter grief through that first gate, but also through all of the others as well. And each can give us a different perspective on the relationship and how we might most fully grieve our loss. We grieve the loss of the parent, but may also grieve the places in us that this parent shamed, and even perhaps the sorrows of the world that our parent grew up in, and the ancestral grief that harmed them and made them inaccessible to us in a way that we needed. Grief is complicated. It is anything but linear. It is not a single set of emotions, predictable. If we close ourselves off from it, we risk losing our connection with others. We risk the ability to live into the wholeness of our human experience. But when we allow ourselves to experience grief, we open ourselves to our shared experiences in life. Grief is our common bond, opening our sorrow and connecting us to everyone. There is no gesture of kindness that is wasted, no offering of compassion that is useless. We can be generous to every sorrow we see. And so this work is sacred work. Where there is sorrow, Oscar Wilde said, there is holy ground. May we not be afraid to tread upon it, but instead open ourselves to the experience, and in doing so, may we live more fully into our human, our communal experience. May it be so. May we make it so.